published in 1929 and becoming popular in the early 1930s, All Quiet on the Western Front became probably the most famous and important war novel of all time. It's about a guy by the name of Paul Balmer and his friends, soldiers, comrades, and the experience that they go through on the Western Front during World War I. It's important to note that this is a work of fiction, so none of the stuff in the book technically actually happened. But the author, Erich Maria Remarque, was there. He was a soldier. He fought for Germany on the Western Front, and he's drawing on his experiences of battle and of life in the trenches. And quite frankly, I've read a lot of firsthand accounts from soldiers and historians and all of this type of thing about World War I, and All Quiet on the Western Front sounds almost exactly like that. I think if anything, he's actually underselling what happened on the Western Front in World War I. So I don't think this is one of those situations where, he's exaggerating to try and sell copies of a book. So in my opinion, it really is a special book, and it's something that I think everyone should learn about, and I think everyone that's interested in World War I should go ahead and read about it. And if you don't believe me, then consider this. When Hitler and the Nazis came to power, they banned this book, and hundreds of copies of the book were burned in public, full display of everybody, and they actually tried to capture Erich Maria Remarque and, probably execute him, but he actually fled the country and, went to Switzerland and escaped the Nazis, but they ended up beheading his sister, just for being associated with the book. So that should really tell you all you need to know about how important this book is. The fact that Hitler thought it was important enough and dangerous enough to his Nazi ideology that he was going to burn the books and kill the author and kill the family of the author, that should tell you why it's important to study All Quiet on the Western Front and the lessons it has to teach us. One thing to note before we really get into All Quiet on the Western Front is that I think throughout the book, there's really less of a focus on tactics and battle strategy and, some of the specifics of how battles work and stuff like that. Although there is some of that, and I think what I've seen there in the book is, relatively accurate as far as how attacks and counterattacks and trench warfare worked. But really the book is more kind of a focus on the themes of World War I and the themes of war in general. So I'm going to focus a little bit more in this podcast on those themes of war and really what the author is saying about war and World War I specifically. Probably the prototypical theme that gets talked about when you're talking about World War I is this idea of the lost generation. So these young kids are going out there and they're fighting this just horrific trench warfare, and it's often said that they would go home from the war and be just completely different people because obviously that experience is going to change you. So it's kind of this idea of that whole generation of people kind of, losing their way, the lost generation. And then there's the other sense of it where, a whole generation was just lost. So, tens of millions of people would be either killed during World War I or, pretty brutally injured or affected in some way or the other. So this idea of the lost generation comes up a lot. When you talk about the beginning of World War I think a lot is made about this kind of idea of these young kids who will get swept up in the glory of war and kind of these, to us they seem ridiculous, but these notions of going to war, as kind of being a great experience and a glorious experience and a way to, help your country and kind of prove your manliness and all this sort of stuff. Of course, these kids believe that, and then they get to the front and they experience trench warfare, and all of a sudden it's a totally different ballgame. And I think all of that is true to an extent, but the author of All Quiet on the Western Front would maybe argue that there's more of a psychological element to why people wanted to volunteer for the war, at least in the early phases. So maybe that has something to do with obedience to authority and conformity and not wanting to let down your friends or your family or not wanting to be seen as weak. So yes, there's kind of this glory of war, but maybe there's also a more practical element to why people volunteered for the war. So here's Remarque talking about this idea in All Quiet on the Western Front, quote, "There was indeed one of us who hesitated and did not want to fall into line. That fellow was Joseph Bem, a plump, homely fellow. But he did allow himself to be persuaded, otherwise he would have been ostracized, and perhaps more of us thought as he did. But no one could very well stand out, because at that time even one's parents were ready with the word coward. No one had the vaguest idea what we were in for." End quote. So here he's talking about a person who wasn't really thrilled to get, signed up for the war, but probably didn't want to admit that, and probably gets a little pressure from friends and family, and because of all those psychological elements of conformity and obedience to authority, all of a sudden he's signing up for this war that's going to end up being horrible. So what ends up happening is you have this kind of strange situation where you have volunteers and young kids signing up for the war, and they know that pretty quickly, once they get to the front, all of the, the lies and kind of the patriotism behind it and kind of the, nationalism stuff, all that stuff falls apart. So this whole generation kind of gets sold on a lie, and the reality changes them, and that's kind of what we think of when we think of the lost generation. So here's another quote. Here he's kind of talking about what school teachers and, the higher-ups in the army are telling him one story, and then the story he sees on the battlefield is something totally different. So, quote, "While they continued to write and talk, we saw the wounded and the dying. While they taught that duty to one's country is the greatest thing, we already knew that death throes are stronger. But for all that, we were no mutineers, no deserters, no cowards. They were very free with all these expressions. We loved our country as much as they. We went courageously into every action. But also we distinguished the false from the true. We had suddenly learned to see, and we saw that there was nothing of their world left. We were all at once terribly alone, and alone we must see it through." End quote. It all just seems unfair. And Remarque talks about this, where a lot of the soldiers, who are out there fighting and dying and living in the trenches, they have to deal with the conditions on the ground, while the people who are selling this idea of war as a good thing and the ones who are actually getting the countries involved in the war, they don't actually have to do the fighting. So there's kind of a classic scene where one of, the main characters talks about how much better would war be if one country's president and another country's president, just got in the ring and, fought it out, and whoever won the fight won the war. So he kind of speculates that war probably would be a lot simpler and more effective and probably more fair if you did it that way, rather than having, people who really have nothing to do with why they got into the war, why these countries got into the war, having them fight it out. This sort of leads into this idea of the soldiers kind of expecting some sort of well-ordered and fair and just situation, because this is what they've been told the war is going to be, and it's what they've been told by the people who are kind of selling this idea of war as a glorious thing. And then they get to the battlefield, and of course, it's anything but well-ordered, and it's chaos, and, it's more just luck more than anything that determines whether or not you die or live in some situations. So overall, I think the novel does a great job of going through this theme of the lost generation and really helping you to understand it, especially if you didn't know too much about World War I. I think this would be a pretty good way to be introduced to it, and then obviously you go out and read, the real histories. Another theme that I kind of zeroed in on while reading All Quiet on the Western Front is the idea of authority and obedience. So we kind of touched on this as a way for people to get recruited into the Army, and certainly also as a way to get them to follow orders and this sort of thing. But listen to this quote from pretty early on in the book, where one of the characters talks about authority. Quote, "For instance, if you train a dog to eat potatoes and then afterwards put a piece of meat in front of him, he'll snap at it. It's his nature. And if you give a man a little bit of authority, he behaves just the same way. He snaps at it too. The things are precisely the same. In himself, man is essentially a beast, only he butters it over like a slice of bread with a little decorum." End quote. What he's saying there is that it's natural for people given authority to act on it, and perhaps to seize more power if they have the opportunity. And, I think, of course, throughout history we see plenty of examples of that. But I think also what he's saying is that it's natural for people to obey authority. And, of course, we've seen plenty of examples of this. I did an episode on, I think it was number 13, Ordinary Men, where, this idea of authority and obedience can lead you to do some horrible things, can lead normal people to do crazy things. Remarque goes through a couple examples of authority throughout the book, and how, these sergeants and leaders in certain segments of the Army are doing things that, the main characters certainly don't agree with and don't find productive to the war effort at all. I think probably the most striking example is, one of these leaders in the trenches has these soldiers who are known as bedwetters. So one of the punishments that he gives them is they have to sleep in a bunk bed, constantly alternating. So, someone's underneath someone who's, sleeping underneath someone who's wetting the bed, obviously, kind of just gross and demoralizing. And, the main character of the book questions whether or not this use of authority is effective or not. It makes you wonder about that. Another theme that's pretty obvious throughout the novel is this idea of the horror of war, and really how depressing and terrifying war really is, and in particular, trench warfare in World War I. So Remarque spends most of chapter 4 discussing this epic bombardment that's going on, and the main character is trying to avoid getting shelled along with the rest of his compatriots, and he's burying his head in the mud, and horses are screaming and wounded, and they're dying all around him, and he's forced to use dead people as his only cover, because it's either bury yourself deeper in the mud or use the dead people around you to get cover. And it just sounds awful. At the end, they kind of see this, at the end of the bombardment, they see this mortally wounded kid, and they have to decide if they want to put him out of his misery. So him and his comrades are kind of just standing around, debating whether or not they're going to shoot this kid and end his life, and it just sounds awful. Towards the end of the chapter, it turns out that this, huge epic bombardment was actually just a minor routine shelling. So it wasn't even a big battle. And it just goes to show how horrifying trench warfare was, and how Remarque is expressing this in particular in All Quiet on the Western Front. And so if you're a soldier who took part in this, how do you go back to regular society after this? How do you go back and reintegrate into normal everyday life? There's a conversation that some of the main characters have about just this, what's going to happen when they go back to everyday life after the war. Here it is, quote, "But what will really happen when we go back?" wonders Mueller. And even he is troubled. Kropp gives a shrug. "I don't know. Let's get back first, and then we'll find out." We are all utterly at a loss. "What could we do?" I ask. "I don't want to do anything," replies Kropp wearily. "You'll be dead one day, so what does it matter? I don't think we'll ever go back." "When I think about it, Albert," I say after a while, rolling on my back, "when I hear the word peacetime, it goes to my head. And if it really came, I think I would do some unimaginable thing. Something you know that is worth having lain here in the muck for. But I can't even imagine anything. All I do know is that this business about professions and studies and salaries and so on, it makes me sick. It is and always was disgusting. I don't see anything at all, Albert. All at once, everything seems to me hopeless and confused. Crop feels it too. It will go pretty hard with us all, but nobody at home seems to worry much about it. 2 years of shells and bombs, a man won't peel that off as easy as a sock. We agree that it's the same for everyone, not only for us here, but everywhere, for everyone who is of our age, to some more, and to others less. It is the common fate of our generation." End quote. One thing that contributes to this kind of depressed theme that these soldiers are feeling is that kind of this role of chance and the idea of fate. And it feels like, unlike what they were told in, boot camp and what they were told by their teachers when they were trying to get them to sign up for the war, it feels like it's not really about skill or how much courage you have or anything like that. It's more just random chance whether you live or whether you die. There were times during these battles, as Remarque describes it, where people would get shelled and, somebody would walk 10 feet down the line and then turn around, and the place he was standing 10 seconds ago, all of a sudden there's, carnage there. There's dead people. It's destroyed. And, it was just luck that he happened to stand up at that particular moment and move to a different spot in the trench. So Remarque describes this here, quote, "It is this chance that makes us indifferent. A few months ago, I was sitting in a dugout playing scat. After a while, I stood up and went to visit some friends in another dugout. On my return, nothing more was to be seen of the first one. It had been blown to pieces by a direct hit. I went back to the second and arrived just in time to lend a hand digging it out. In the interval, it had been buried." End quote. So again, we see this idea of, it's kind of just luck whether or not you survive. What might be the most important theme when looking at All Quiet on the Western Front is dehumanization. And the idea of dehumanization is, the definition for me is seeing your enemy as something less than human in order to make the task of killing them easier to accomplish. So we see examples of dehumanization, throughout the war and throughout other wars, and many people have credited, this as the main reason for genocides and things like that. And some people actually think dehumanization is overrated. I read an interesting article from Paul Bloom, a psychologist at Yale, who said this whole dehumanization thing is overrated. And maybe I'll link to that, but I think it's real. Okay, I think dehumanization is a thing, and I think Remarque did as well, because he describes it over and over again throughout the book. And when you read accounts of some of the most horrible things in history, a lot of times you'll see this, just reading the first-hand accounts. So here's Remarque describing one of these situations where he feels like dehumanization is going on. Quote, "We crouch behind every corner, behind every barrier of barbed wire, and hurl heaps of explosives at the feet of the advancing enemy before we run. The blast of the hand grenades impinges powerfully on our arms and legs. Crouching like cats, we run on, overwhelmed by this wave that bears us along, that fills us with ferocity, turns us into thugs, into murderers, into God knows only what devils. This wave that multiplies our strength with fear and madness and greed of life, seeking and fighting for nothing but our own deliverance. If your own father came over with them, you would not hesitate to fling a bomb at him. We have become wild beasts. We do not fight, we defend ourselves against annihilation. It is not against men that we fling our bombs. What do we know of men in this moment when death is hunting us down? Now, for the first time in 3 days, we can see his face. Now, for the first time in 3 days, we can oppose him. We can feel a mad anger. No longer do we lie helpless, waiting on the scaffold. We can destroy and kill to save ourselves and be revenged." End quote. One thing you notice if you pay attention to that quote is it seems like dehumanization, it's one of those things where you're dehumanizing the enemy, portraying the enemy as something less than human so that you can justify killing them. But I think what's in there also is you can kind of dehumanize yourself, and you stop viewing yourself as, a human actor with choices and, morality and all these things, and just kind of become the beast, and you can start doing things that you wouldn't normally do under regular situations. And this trench warfare and, war in general is going to really challenge what people think they can become capable of. This leads to a obvious theme of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and the effect that it had on the lost generation and all of the people coming back from the war and reintegrating into society, as we've talked about. So I think Remarque does a great job of kind of describing that feeling and really expressing it so that more people would know about it and be able to react accordingly. Remarque also does a great job of explaining kind of the brotherhood and this theme of camaraderie that soldiers and people who went through this epic disaster of World War I went through. This is one of the things that's interesting to me, is that World War I can be kind of a way to look at your own circumstances in the present and realize that, you really don't have it that bad. So, how much of my time, how much of your time is spent worrying about things that really don't matter. I mean, I think what I spend my time thinking about, and sometimes the stuff that, keeps me and, other people up at night, and you have to sit back and ask yourself, does all of that stuff really matter? After you've fought, after you've read about people fighting in the trenches for a few days, I think that kind of shifts your priorities as far as what becomes important. And what becomes more important is the things that I think Remarque hits on, friends, comrades, family, sharing experiences, and contributing something meaningful to the world. And trying to do that is kind of the struggle. And I think this is part of the reason that World War I is so interesting to me, and really history in general, is it's a way to kind of ground your expectations and your anxieties about life, and, really put things in perspective. So I really do think that reading about that theme of brotherhood, camaraderie, definitely helps that. And what's interesting is Remarque was a German soldier. During the book, he talks a lot about how the German soldiers would think about, well, if we have this brotherhood, this camaraderie, then probably the soldiers on the other side do as well. So war is often more complicated than a simple us versus them. Things can be murky. There can be a morally, ethically gray background to a conflict, and obviously that was the case in World War I. Late in the book, Remarque has a line that says, "A hospital alone shows what war is." And first of all, I think it might be interesting to look at the way Remarque compares the life in the hospital, that, after these soldiers get injured, they go to the hospital, and he kind of compares and contrasts hospital life with life in the trenches. And I think that's something that's actually interesting to look at. But this idea of a hospital alone shows what war is. It really is a good way to encapsulate World War I. In the final two sentences of the book, okay, spoiler alert here, but a nameless, emotionless narrator takes over, and he kind of drives home all the themes of the book. So here's that kind of nameless narrator describing what happens to the main character in the last two sentences of the book. Quote, "He fell in October 1918, on a day that was so quiet and still on the whole front that the Army report confined itself to a single sentence. All quiet on the Western Front. He had fallen forward and lay on the earth as though sleeping. Turning him over, one saw that he could not have suffered long. His face had an expression of calm, as though almost glad the end had come." End quote. So it seems like the author is saying that this is what war gets you. This is the cost of war. Okay, so there's no heroic last stand like some sort of war movie. There's no, sacrificial speech and then charge. It's just the protagonist dying another senseless, unremarkable death. And he was just one amongst hundreds, thousands that would die that same day, and millions that would die throughout the war during World War I. So when you want to think about war and the cost of war and what it gets you, that's something to remember.